Now, there are obviously broader trends at work that I don't want to discount. The Middle East is going through one of the great youth bulges of human history. Let's describe a youth bulge as something where 50% of the population is under the age of 30. Well, in the Middle East, something in the nature of 65% of the population is under the age of 30, between 60 and 65%. It's one of the largest youth bulges in history. So you have all these young people coming into these countries, dissatisfied, unemployed, half-educated or ill-educated, and searching for some sense of place and dignity. And they have regimes that offer very little of any of this. And that process this is a very broad demographic process. It seems very unlikely to be dissipated by a small concession here or a small advance. It is something that throughout human history has been a very, very powerful force. To put it very bluntly, in any country where there are too many young men, it is a problem. The James Q. Wilson, a great political scientist, once said, if you want to try to understand the problem of violent crime in America, it's very simple. If you lock up every young man between the ages of 15 and 25, violent crime declines in America by 97%. That's basically who does it. So if you think about it in those terms, whenever you have a disproportionately large number of young men, and let's face it, the socialization of young men is one of the principal challenges of every civilization, right? That's why we have boarding schools, military schools, the military itself. And when you have that proportion at the stage it is in the Middle East, it always causes trouble. If you look historically, the French Revolution was preceded by a youth bulge, the Iranian Revolution was preceded by a youth bulge, and even places where the whole story is a much happier one, there is still enormous turmoil and dislocation. The peak year for the youth bulge in the United States and Western Europe, you will not be surprised to learn, was 1968. So the year of greatest social upheaval in the Western world in the last 40 or 50 years. So when you look at the Middle East, you have to recognize part of this is demographic, part of this is but another word for the youth bulge is the baby boom. So when you handle it right, it can be an enormous force for progress. It can be an enormous force that fuels economic growth. After all, China and India are not worrying so much about the fact that they have lots of young people. They're actually fueling their economies because of that reality. So the central problem here is that the economies of the Middle East have simply not found ways to do anything with these people. And that, in some ways, gets you to the heart of the problem in the Middle East today, which has been a problem of rentier states, of oil economies. And now you'd say, they're not all oil economies, that's true. But take a country like Egypt. Egypt has some oil, not a lot by Middle Eastern standards, but actually not bad by global standards. But if you take all the revenue that the Egyptian government gets as an accident of geography, that would be the oil and natural gas that is under its land, the revenues from the Suez Canal, Egypt just got lucky as to where it was, and the amount of money it gets from tourism, that collectively adds up to 30% of government revenues. So what you create in these societies is a government that does not need to produce wealth in its society and then tax its citizens, but rather can simply extract the wealth from the ground or in these other easy ways. So that the politics of it is that if you don't need your people to produce wealth so that you can tax them, you don't need to give them very much in return. So the Saudi Arabian regime has a kind of bargain with its people that is something like the inverse of the slogan that launched the American Revolution. The Saudi royal family says to its people, this is going to be very simple. No taxation, no representation. We won't tax you, we won't represent you. It is only when you need to tax people that they begin to say, well, wait a minute. If you're going to take my money, you need to represent me. You need to give me good government. But the Saudis say, no taxation, no representation. And that bargain, which is at the heart of the modern Middle East, is beginning to break down. And it is breaking down in every place in the Middle East. What is striking to see is the diversity of these movements. Clearly, they are strongest in places like Tunisia and Egypt, which need the world. Right? Tunisia needs Europe, needs European exports, needs European markets, needs European tourism. Egypt, with all that I said, it powerfully needs the tourists, who are all Western. It needs the aid that comes from the United States. It needs the investment. But then you have Bahrain, which is a relatively rich country. Per capita GDP is about 14,000. But there you have the issues of inequality between the Shia and Sunnis. And then you have Libya, a very rich country, 5-6 million people sitting on a lot of oil, but incredibly brutal dictatorship. I mean, people forget that Gaddafi is not, just because he's such a comical madman. This is a very, very nasty regime. This is, Freedom House does a ranking of regimes around the world, and it has, I think, the bottom 6, the bottom 5, which are called the worst of the worst. And Gaddafi's Libya made that list last year. In fact, I think it was even ranked #1, by which I mean it was the least free country in the world. I think it was tied with North Korea. So the reality here is that you have structural reasons why I believe that what you're seeing in the Middle East right now is not a series of isolated events, and they are not things that will die down. Now, they may be beaten back temporarily. If you think back to 1848 in Europe, you had a revolution that began in Sicily, overthrew the monarchy there, then went to France, overthrew the monarchy there, and coursed forward through Germany, Hungary. But in 2 years, everything was reversed. Right? The military stayed loyal to the monarchs. The troops beat back the protesters. Nothing changed, or so it seemed. Because if you look back and say, what were the goals of the revolutionaries of 1848? They were nationalism. They wanted all the German-speaking people to be united in one country. It was liberalism. They wanted fewer monarchies, more parliaments with more power, individual rights. Almost all those things happen over the next 10 or 15 years in just different guises. So my own sense is it will be very difficult to go back to the old Middle East. Many of these regimes will stay in power. They have a lot of firepower. Many of the monarchs will make concessions that will be phony. But over time, it feels to me as though you've unleashed a force here that is going to be very difficult to stop. And there will be many potential turning points, right? Gaddafi has to die one day. There will be other leaders whose terms in office, already you have heard the president of Yemen say he will not run again. You've heard other presidents make these kinds of claims. So you have many points at which this process can be influenced. But the main point I want to leave you with is just this thought that we're really witnessing something world historical. And it is going to be very messy. It is without question going to involve some chaos, some bloodshed, and in many cases these new regimes will not be particularly good. I mean, they will not be any better than the old regimes perhaps. But it's very difficult not to believe that there will not be an improvement in terms of the dignity and happiness of the peoples of the Middle East who have lived really as the laggards of the modern world, while the rest of the world has been moving toward greater openness in economics and politics and social affairs. In the Middle East, you have seen actually a retrogression. So that would it be fair to say that an Egyptian living in Egypt in 2010 was in many significant senses less free than an Egyptian in Egypt, in Cairo in 1950. In 1950, you had a constitutional monarchy, you had parliament, you had free press, you had rights. In 2010, you had none of that. Very few places in the world of which you could say that. The entire historical trajectory of the world has been in one direction. And so finally, perhaps, what you're seeing is the beginning of a process by which the Middle East is catching up with the rest of the world. It'll be a roller coaster ride. But I remain hopeful that at the end of it, you will have a somewhat more stable Middle East that does not have these pent-up pressures and these pent-up tensions that release themselves through terrorism and Islamic extremism. Thank you very much.